Hi, this is Matthew Baldwin of Mars Hill University, and this is the Ideas of Jesus video podcast, episode 7. I'm joined here today by Clare K. Rothschild, an old friend of mine, and I'm very glad to see you, Clare. Thanks for being here today.
Pleasure.
Clare K. Rothschild is Professor of Scripture Studies at Lewis University and Professor Extraordinary, Department of Ancient Studies at Stellenbosch University in South Africa. Her main research interests are Luke Acts, the Muratorian Fragment, and the Apostolic Fathers. Clare spent a half a year as a Humboldt Fellow in Munich researching her book, Hebrews as Pseudepigraphon, on the Pauline attribution of this early Christian text. Her current research focuses on the Epistle of Barnabas, and you have a forthcoming commentary from Hermenea on that volume, on that letter. And you serve as the general editor of Early Christianity with Brill, as well as the SBL series, Writings from the Greco-Roman World. Clare has a Master of Theological Studies from Harvard Divinity School and a Doctor of Philosophy from the University of Chicago. In her spare time, she enjoys yoga and playing the cello in various small orchestras and ensembles. Clare, thanks for being here today.
Yeah, delighted.
You have studied so many different things, and your expertise is wide-ranging, but I think for scholars of the historical Jesus or of the Jesus traditions in early Christianity, the most provocative and interesting work that you have offered for us to be thinking about is from your 2005 book, Baptist Traditions and Q, which was published in WUNT, Series 1. And this book, as I understand it, makes some fairly provocative claims about the origins of material that is attributed to Jesus by the Q materials. And it also deals at length with the question, a really important question for students of Jesus about the relationship of Jesus or the Jesus traditions and the Baptist traditions. I'd really like to start there, but for the sake of my viewership, my students, and other interested lay people, could you give us a quick rundown of what you mean when you say Q?
Sure. Yeah, Q is the reference. It comes from the German word Quelle, and which means source. And it refers to the verbatim agreement between Matthew and Luke that is absent from Mark. So it's a hypothesis of a second source that Matthew and Luke used in addition to Mark when they wrote their Gospels.
So do you yourself think it's a good hypothesis? Was there really a Q?
So when I wrote that book, Baptist Traditions and Q, I didn't take a position on whether Q existed. I just presumed that it existed. And I said, if it exists, this is what I think it is. To the question of whether I think it exists, I think it's an excellent hypothesis, but I also harbor beliefs that would undercut the idea of Q. For example, that Luke wrote in response to Matthew in some way. And so I'm inconsistent, and Mark Goodacre, who is a good friend of mine, will point to all of my inconsistencies. But John Kloppenborg is also a good friend and a brilliant scholar, and so I see the merit in many of his arguments.
So you're referring, of course, to John Kloppenborg's support of the Q hypothesis, very strong supporter of the idea that there was a written Q. And which version of the synoptic problem solutions does Goodacre accept? Like, so if Luke used Matthew, then that's called which hypothesis? What do we call that?
I think it's Farrar.
The Farrar hypothesis as a solution. It's a different kind of way of approaching the synoptic problem.
Yeah.
Okay, so can you also explain for us what you mean by Baptist traditions in Q?
Yeah, so this is really interesting, I think. So there are Baptist traditions, in my parlance, are any traditions in the New Testament, in the Gospels, 4 Gospels, that refer to John the Baptist. Interesting, by the way, Paul doesn't reference John the Baptist.
That is interesting.
I've always kind of wondered about. But But anyway, any tradition, not just the Q traditions, but any traditions that refer to John the Baptist, I just call them Baptist traditions. Of course, all my students think I'm an expert in the American Baptist, which I know about. But anyway, so that's how I use that expression. And then the book is about how the Q's materials resemble Baptist traditions.
Okay, so for a quick pause, what kind of evidence do we have? People are always arguing about the evidence for Jesus, but what kind of evidence do we have for John the Baptist?
Yeah, so this is a great question. John the Baptist has not attracted the same attention as Jesus, obviously, and doesn't have, volumes of lives. And even worse than that, he has some lives and no Albert Schweitzer
Right.
to explain the problem of those lives. Nevertheless, there have been people who have taken up, John the Baptist historically. A great answer to your question, I think, is John Ruhlman says, what do we know about John the Baptist? Well, if we have a whisper of Jesus, of John, we have an echo of a whisper.
Uh-huh.
So there's, on one hand, not so much. But on the other hand, I'd say on the positive side, Josephus, I think, doesn't write about Jesus. We could debate that another time. But Josephus almost certainly writes about John the Baptist. And what he says is pretty interesting, and it sort of corroborates some of the things we have in the Gospels. So, and especially when you think, Josephus didn't seem to admire very much or think very highly of apocalyptic movements. So to what extent John is apocalyptic, or why Josephus thought, well, despite his apocalypticism, he needs to be mentioned, is I think really fascinating, conundrum.
Okay, so for those who might have been asleep that day during class, what about John the Baptist links him with apocalyptic movements?
Well, he seems to be, to the extent that we can tell from the little evidence that we have, pronouncing a coming kingdom and a coming Messiah. And I think he regards, and I genuinely think he regarded himself as announcing this Messiah. I think he was saying something along the lines of, we need to get our act together, and if we do, and we cross over to the other side of the Jordan and we'll come back in to the land, then we can present God with, ethical people dealing responsibly with his land, and maybe he'll bring a Messiah, right? Protection from Roman taxation.
So we accept the idea that there was a John the Baptist, even though we have only an echo of a whisper about him. And we think he was proclaiming a coming change of the era, change of the world by God, an apocalyptic transformation of the world. And it had something to do with the Jordan, and he was out there preaching. What was he preaching?
So he was preaching ethics. He was saying, like I mentioned earlier, we have to get straight. Like, we've been misbehaving. God is disappointed with our behavior. So I think his message was primarily ethical. And to the extent the New Testament puts that forward, I think it's probably right. It's not a bad, he probably was not any kind of forgiveness of sins, in the sense, I think that the Jewish sacrificial system is intact, and that's the way that sins are forgiven. But I think that this was a kind of ritual act by a group of people, because the land now is tainted with sin, and because things are so bad, that is the natural deduction. And somehow we have to reverse that before we're chucked out or all dead.
Okay. So when we turn the lens onto the four canonical Gospels, what is distinctive about the Baptist traditions that appear in Q?
Okay, so first I want to say, one of the things that happened in the 1950s that not everyone is aware of is that there were arguments about the first 3 chapters of Luke, that a written Baptist source was being used. Because if you look at those chapters, Matt, this, you'll see a section on John the Baptist, and then you'll see an imitative one about Jesus. And then you'll see one about John and an imitative one about Jesus. And so people have argued, and it was around the 1950s this happened, that it was a written source that was being used. So we already have kind of some arguments about written Baptist sources. And then also, if you look at Acts, you know, in the later chapter of Acts where we have John the Baptist's followers showing up, there's also kind of the idea that there are Baptists that are still hanging around when the Jesus movement is up and running, like in Paul's day or at the end of Paul's career. So my Q hypothesis builds on those ideas. And the Q hypothesis, well, I think it's kind of interesting. If you take a look at the reconstruction of Q, Jesus' name is mentioned almost nowhere. Like one of the first line in the reconstruction, the critical edition of Q by Kloppenborg et al., their first line is Q30, and it says Jesus. And to me, it looks like special pleading, you know. God bless you.
We figured that Jesus was probably the first word in Q, but we don't know for sure.
Okay, the next thing that happens is, of course, John. And yeah, it's unbelievable. John figures at the beginning of Q, right in the middle at the climax of Q, and at the end of Q in the reconstructed model. And this is on John Kloppenborg's reconstruction. So I started to look at this, and then I noticed other things like, you know, the red herring, if you will, is Luke 11:1, Q 11:1, which says that Jesus' disciples said to him, "Teach us to pray as John taught his disciples." And Jesus says, "Pater Hamon." So that, and that's one of the, what would you say, hallmark features of Q is the Lord's Prayer or the Paternoster. So it looks to me like that is actually attributed to John the Baptist by Luke. Luke is flagging us. John knew this prayer, taught it to Jesus. Jesus taught it to others.
So wait, are you saying the Lord's Prayer is misnamed? The Lord's Prayer should be named the Baptist's Prayer?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
But I mean, I think that the Lord, Jesus, also, he knew it. And so he taught it because he had learned it. But John actually, I mean, where John got it, I mean, I'm not necessarily saying John, you know, invented it. But I think that Jesus got it from John, and I think Luke is telling us that.
So Luke preserves, and that was in Q, but then Matthew kind of effaces it because his disciples don't ask, teach us to pray as John taught us to pray.
That's right. I think there are a couple places where Matthew tells us more about John the Baptist and Luke less, and then vice versa. We can remind me to talk about the Transfiguration in a minute.
Okay.
But if you have Luke, I think what Luke and Matthew both did is they had Mark, and they were like, but Jesus, we want him to have more info. You know, as it is, Mark copies the miracle katina, right? He's doubled the miracle katina. So you have 4 miracles, then you have 8 miracles, and he's showing this, you know, he's trying to build out the information, and it seems like they don't have very much. Matthew and Luke build it out even more by adding Q. Now, those teachings were probably teachings that were attributed to the Baptists, but there's no reason to believe that Jesus didn't teach them also. So I think Matthew and Luke felt vindicated, like, yeah, we can build this out with teaching from John the Baptist because, you know, this is kind of one movement, and Jesus clearly, maybe Jesus even modified the tradition. My guess is that John is the one that came up with these great teachings, and Jesus was his right-hand person, and maybe his physician, doctor, healer, you know, magician kind of talent. And the only thing is that I think when John died, John tapped Jesus as his successor.
So it sounds like we're looking through the text back into a moment when Jesus and John had a very close relationship. What's the best argument for establishing that was the case in your mind?
So that brings me to the Transfiguration. First of all, it's the baptism. It's definitely the baptism.
Okay.
To be baptized, to join in John's baptism likely meant to some kind of discipleship relationship. But beyond that, and then, you know, there are lots of other pericopes about John and Jesus and their relationship, including in the 4th gospel. But one of the things I think is super interesting is, you know, the Transfiguration. Mark has, in the very beginning of the Gospel of Mark sets John the Baptist up as Elijah with the camel hair and the leather girdle and eating, as Jim Kelloffers taught us all about, the locust and wild honey.
Yes.
The diet of locust and wild honey. A brilliant book, by the way, everyone should read it. But so he sets John up as Elijah. Now, in Mark 9, Jesus goes up on the mountain of where he's transfigured. You know, he turns like, starts to glow or something. And it says, I think it's super fascinating. It says, Elijah appeared with Moses. Well, that word appeared in Greek, ophthe, is actually a technical term for resurrecting, being resurrected. So I think what happens in that moment is John the Baptist has just died, right, in chapter 6, and he is risen from the dead on the mountain of Transfiguration. And Jesus sees him, and God then points to Jesus and says, now listen to him. In other words, this is the formal succession narrative. And then when Jesus sees that, he feels he can go forward into Jerusalem, and he's probably going to be killed, but it doesn't matter because there is a resurrection from the dead, and he has witnessed it in John the Baptist. It may even explain, and this is, I mean, it's all hypothetical, but why at the end of Mark, different from the other the other synoptic gospels, when the women are in the tomb, they see the man dressed in white, and he says that, don't worry, Jesus is risen. He's gone ahead of you to Galilee. So maybe the idea is he's there risen, just like John was risen there.
In Galilee.
Yeah.
So how does the portrait of the Baptist in Q, what kinds of teachings, one of the things that we notice is in Luke, you get a much fuller picture of what the Baptist is teaching, and his ethics, his teachings really resemble the Sermon on the Mount in many ways. So is that one of the pieces of evidence that you use to argue for this, for the fact that the Baptists may have supplied Jesus with some of his teachings?
Yes, there are definitely correspondences. And by the way, I was just reading Mary Beard the other day, SPQR. And did you know, I didn't realize this, but like cloak stealing was a thing, like a big problem. So I've started to think a lot about, like, not only, you know, when they take, you know, if he takes your cloak, like give him your tunic or whatever. I was like, that's super generous in a day if everyone's trying to steal coats. But anyway, so yes, the correspondence that I see, and this is actually one of the reasons that I originally started turning this idea around, is that the Jesus traditions in Mark, or not, that the ones that are not in Q, are less austere. And the Q traditions are famously very austere. I mean, you know, there are books and books about the Jesus of Q being, you know, a very ascetic kind of person, and that community must have represented, you know, must have been ascetic and all of this. And I was wondering about that, because I was thinking that's funny, because John is ascetic and Jesus is not, and Q is ascetic. And then I was like, and Q has the Lord's Prayer, and Q starts with John and ends with John. And I just started to see that there were more correspondences between Baptist traditions and Q than the non-Q Jesus traditions and Q.
So what is the basic theory that we need to develop to understand how Q got written then, in light of these observations about its relationship to the Baptist?
Yeah, well, I think we just borrow all the ones about how the Jesus traditions got written. I mean, I think Q, one thing I didn't say exactly is, if you're still like warming up to what Q is, it's a list of sayings. And there aren't really narratives in it or miracles. There's a few exceptions which are complicated. But basically it's a list of sayings. And but there is no quotation formula. The sayings don't include a quotation formula attributing them to Jesus. And I don't think they ever had one. I think they had a quotation formula originally attributing them to John the Baptist. But in any case, I think that those sayings, just in the way that we think by form criticism that Jesus traditions, sayings were written down, I think that this happened with Baptist traditions.
So the Baptist disciples were recording his sayings in a form of a logosophon type document. That's something that would resemble, say, Thomas in the Christian tradition or something like that.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. I think, probably just using form criticism, they were short memorizable units of text, the definition of form, and repeated. in context of worship and catechesis and so forth, and eventually probably written down in a way that Matthew and Luke could find them and then reappropriate them for Jesus.
And they just did this without shame on account of the fact that Jesus was essentially the chosen successor of the Baptist.
Yeah.
Or that Jesus actually did learn his teachings from the Baptist.
Yeah. I mean, I'll tell you exactly. The one argument against it that I've heard that I thought was reasonable is in Luke 11, when the disciples asked Jesus about the prayer that John taught him. The one thing people have, or Hans-Dieter Betz, in fact, acknowledged or prodded me on, many of the followers of Jesus followed John the Baptist first. So, for example, Peter and Andrew. So if Peter and Andrew and Jesus were all disciples of the Baptist, then why would they not? They would know the prayer of John the Baptist already, and they wouldn't ask Jesus that prayer, right? But of course, the disciples are not specified, so, and it's very narrow, the ones that were but I mean, I still think it's a decent, I like to think about all the different angles and possibilities, and I don't mind in the slightest if I'm wrong. My goal is that we would all get a little bit closer to this historical circumstance.
Well, it's certainly fascinating to think about. It seems like the Gospels are take pains to distinguish Jesus from John, and John is the forerunner, and then he kind of steps out of the way, and Jesus takes over, and he's presented as something unique. But if we start to think about the two movements as being closer in their teaching and closer in their ethic, or even one as a successor to the other, that changes the picture a little bit, I would say.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, John's gospel presents something different, maybe because it is deliberately rejecting the idea of succession, but that the idea that they're simultaneous and competitive. But of course, later, I think they are simultaneous and competitive. That's what I mentioned when we have that passage in Acts where Paul of Acts says, bumps into followers of the Baptist. Later, then we assume, most scholars do assume, that there is kind of competition between the two groups. And by the way, like, one of the reasons that Matthew and Luke might have done what they did is because they had Baptists in their congregations, and that wanted to hear those wonderful old sayings. And since it made sense to combine them, and then you could have kind of like, you could merge the two groups. I mean, again, it's hypothetical, but it's interesting, I think, to think about this aspect of the two movements.
Does it seem best to regard that passage in Acts as reflecting something historically real, that there were rival Baptist groups even into the later first century, active even in Asia Minor and other places like that?
I think, given what we know about the Jesus movement, seems probable. But I don't think Acts is our only evidence, and it's very, very fragile. Very, very fragile. But then the other thing is we have Mandeans and all of that. We could go down another path.
That's what I was going to ask you about. I mean, on the one hand, you might start to say it just seems improbable, like what happened to the Baptist movement if it was actually independent and continued. On the other hand, we have the Mandeans who trace their religious practice back to the Baptists, and they're still with us. But does that movement actually go back to John the Baptist?
I have no idea.
Yeah, I don't either.
I really do not know. But, and I would say another, looking at the reverse side is also possibly interesting, which is that Paul was very successful. He was very persuasive and very successful, and Paul never mentions John the Baptist. And there's something there, Matt, that I do not know, but that somebody should figure out, if it's possible to figure it out.
Paul makes no mention of the Baptists at all.
No, in fact, in 1 Corinthians, he says, God did not send me to baptize. That's a crazy passage about how I baptized nobody, except Crispus and Gaius. And He goes, and maybe the household of Stephanus. And I always get the feeling that Sosthenes is writing, and Paul's like, wait, you didn't write that, did you? So, but anyway, and then he kind of denigrates, in my view, baptizing. But God did not send me to baptize, as though that's some kind of like janitorial position or something, And so there's something odd there that I don't really understand.
Well, it is kind of difficult to I guess this one thing we can be sure of is that the Christians practice baptism. All right. I mean, this ritual as an initiation procedure was around in Paul's day and presumably before. And they must have gotten it from the Baptist, from John the Baptist. And that maybe the Baptist traditions are at least a recognition of that.
Yeah, but Matt, there's a whole thing there too about what Paul's baptism was. I think you're right. And I think Paul knows a baptism too. But whether it's John's baptism, and something must have happened where the two baptisms merge, where, and we may even get this in Jesus' baptism story, the spirit like a dove is on him, and also there's water and John.
Well, this is now making me wonder if you have an opinion. You don't have to opine on this if you don't. Many people have argued that John the Baptist is somehow related to the Essene movement, and looking at Qumran and elsewhere, and it's hypothesized that the Essenes valued some kind of baptismal practice or mikvot bathing practice, purification practice. Is that something that you care to say anything about?
It's wonderful. Matt Goff, another mutual friend of ours, and I were actually at Qumran visiting there together, and they had some little, at the time, they had some little mini cave that you could go in that was just like next to the gift shop. And you would go in there, and they were reeling an old video that they made. The video had all these men in it wearing, like Harawachi, or Mexican sandals and burlap sacks or whatever. And then they're speaking in like loosely in Aramaic to each other, and all of a sudden somebody walks in the room and they go, Johannes. So it's like they were trying to show us in this video that like John the Baptist was there. And I think, everybody jumped to conclusions very quickly in the 1950s when the Dead Sea Scrolls were being unveiled for the first time, that John the Baptist was there, even Jesus was there, or Mary was there. Einon at Salim we assume that it was right there on the Jordan River near the Dead Sea and near Qumran. And so the proposal then became, John lived there and was trained there. I love the idea. I think there's no evidence. I have no idea. It seems very unlikely to me. I think, Luke presents John as a child of the high priest. And so I usually picture, and this is totally uncorroborated, but I kind of picture that John was in a child of the high priest and really disenchanted with the way the Sadducees were running the temple, and took off into the wilderness and said, God's not going to have this. He's not going to protect us unless we repent, basically, each one of us individually. And then I think he thought a ritual to go with this would be appropriate. And by the way, there are lots and lots of baptizing movements at this time in this place. So assuming that John is an Essene at Qumran, it's very tidy.
It's a little too tidy.
Yeah.
So I'm assuming you're also not going to endorse any ideas that Jesus is actually a secret emissary of the Essenes or any of the other wild fictionalizations of Jesus' life that came out of the 19th century.
No. I think I really don't like putting down this brilliant scholars who came before us and all of the work that they did, and they taught me a lot. But there's a level of conjecture, and especially when it's idealistic,
yeah. Well, Claire, I know that recently you've been working on the Muratorian Fragment, which nobody in my audience knows what that is. And I'd really like to give you an opportunity to say a little bit of something about it. I know what it is. I've written about it because it has something to do with the formation of the canon of early Christianity. And I'm wondering if your work on the Muratorian canon sheds any light on the traditions that we have on Jesus. I mean, is there a connection there to talk about?
They're not, it doesn't speak exactly to the Jesus traditions, but to their coherence or their sturdiness, I think, is what's going on. So the Muratorian Fragment is sort of like a canon list, but it's really a little bit longer than a list and a little bit shorter than a prologue. And it lists most of the books of the 27 book canon of the New Testament, but not all of them. And at the very end of it, it's about 85 lines long. And in line 74 to 77 or so, it appears to date itself to the bishopric of Pope Pius, which would be around 150, 160 CE. We don't have any list of the 27 books of the New Testament that early. All of our lists start around the year 330. To have a list that's dated to 160 or so is absolutely a dream come true. And that, I think, is a bit of a problem. It is actually a dream. It is not a reality. So I've worked hard. So there are, to make a long story short, in the 80s, I think it's the 70s and 80s, basically both, a man named Sundberg came up with the idea that the text is not actually dating itself to that time. It's dated to the 4th century. And another man named Jeff Hahnemann argued that it is indeed dated to the 4th century. And we ended up with two camps that still exist today. Some people think that this list is very early, dated to the middle of the 2nd century. And some people think, no way, the list is much later. And I've worked on ameliorating these two positions. For example, I put forward the idea that it's written in the 4th century to seem like it's written in the 2nd century. And I've also put forward the idea that it's not actually dating itself to the 2nd century. It's dating itself to the word, the phrase is temporibus nostris. And instead of being our time, I put forward that it might mean, it's not a great argument, but it might mean our circumstances, that is in Rome. So it's placing itself in Rome, but not necessarily. So there are other ways of thinking about what's going on here. But so this would mean, though, if we have the 27 canon New Testament set in the year 160 or 70, then the Jesus traditions are, perhaps they are, what would you say, widespread accepted as canon at a much earlier date. Now, the other thing, Matt, is, of course, these texts can be in use and can be the acceptable text without a list.
Sure.
Right? And they're the texts that are already in conversation with Justin Martyr, which is prior to Pope Pius. But it's just the list itself is something people, like the idea of.
Well, it seems one of the problems that we have when we're approaching Jesus is that there's this wide diversity of early literature about him, whether it's the Christian apocryphal gospels or all the dialogue and revelatory texts. And I suppose the impulse for us is to want to make sure that we are using the best sources possible to reconstruct Jesus. And some people seem to want to believe that even from a very early age, Christians knew not to listen to certain sources and to listen carefully to others. But you're suggesting that maybe the Muratorian Fragment is not the solution to those who want that outcome.
Right. Yeah, I don't think it is. But it's interesting on your point. The Muratorian Fragment says the Apocalypse of Peter is A-OK. And the Shepherd of Hermas should not be published with the prophets of the apostles, but can be read. So again, it's not exactly the 27 books of the New Testament. And by the way, Hebrews and James and 1st and 2nd Peter and one of the letters of John are left out of the fragment. So again, if you're talking about which sources are the most reliable for reconstructing Jesus, then we have some diversity. Not that those texts impinge very much on our picture of Jesus or John, but still the general point.
Well, Claire, I'm going to let you go at this point. I know you're very busy, and we all are at this time. I thank you so much for sitting down with me and talking about John the Baptist and the Q traditions about the Baptist. Or I'm still feeling a little confused. Are they about the Q traditions? Or are they about Jesus, or about the Baptist, or somehow both now?
They're the sayings of the Baptist.
They're the same. Q, it presents the sayings of the Baptist, and they've been adopted by the Jesus tradition. Partly because perhaps Jesus taught them, continued to teach his teachers materials. I think that's a very provocative idea. It remains absolutely mind-blowing to think about a closer relationship between Jesus and the Baptist, or between the Jesus movement and the Baptist movement, than I think we're used to. Thank you so much, Claire.
Absolutely.